Thanks, Aaron. All right, I'll just start. I've got a presentation, so I'll just share my screen quickly with you now. Okay. All right, so hello everyone, and yeah, good morning from all the way down here in Sydney. My name's Sam Lane. As Aaron just said, I'm a PhD candidate from Western Sydney University, and I'm one of the 4 authors of the paper that I'm going to present to you today, which is soon to be published in the International Journal of Sport and Society. So myself, Dr. Neil Hall, who's with us today, also of Western Sydney University, Leon Keir, who's here as well, of One Wellbeing, and Keir Lawrence, also of One Wellbeing, and not here at the moment as he's currently getting ready for the rugby league season and will be heading to training a little later today. We're the research team that pulled this project together, and yeah, we're really excited and very grateful to have the opportunity to share our work with you. We really believe that this research kind of brings a bit of a new insight into the plight of Australian athletes and their engagement with education, and yeah, we really hope that you're able to take something from it as well. First thing though, before I get into our data and our findings, I just want to spend a couple of minutes firstly contextualising why education in sport even matters. You know, why should you be interested in this paper, and what kind of impact are we hoping to make with it? And I want to start here with the positive relationship of education on performance. So last year, Professor David Lavalley, who no doubt you're all familiar with, published a paper evidencing the positive impact of education on athletes' performance. So he tracked all 632 of our professional rugby league athletes over 3 seasons, and he measured across 25,000 performance indicators to find that on average, players who were engaged in pre-retirement planning were selected, 1, more often by their clubs, 2, stayed at one club for a longer period of time, and 3, on average, had longer careers. So it was an important paper. It was kind of the first of its kind, and it really put forward a strong evidence-based case for how performance benefits from education. Next, education is good for the brand of sport. You know, we set really high expectations of athletes to uphold a standard of behaviour both on and off the field. And so, you know, we really have a responsibility to try to meet that expectation with the right kind of investment resources and support. You know, if I'm to put it kind of really plainly and simply, you know, when we have better ambassadors for sport, we have better representation. And I really think that it's at that point that we become more attractive to our future potential commercial partners. And lastly, education is critical for athletes' wellbeing. What we know in Australia is that athletes are overrepresented in certain mental health issues, and that includes generalised anxiety disorder and substance misuse. And we know that athletes are at their most vulnerable when transitioning out of sport into retirement. But education, or pre-retirement planning, is the most effective early intervention and prevention strategy that keeps athletes safe into, through, and out of their sport journey. You know, you speak to almost any retired player, at least any that I've spoken to, and they almost all unanimously say the same thing, that they really wish they did more while they were playing. So whether your interest in education is motivated by performance, commercial interests, or you feel a genuine sense of duty of care and responsibility for your athletes, you know, there's a really convincing argument to be made for investing in elite athlete education. Now, of course, a performance focus is always going to be at the centre of elite sporting environments, but research is really telling us that this doesn't have to be at the detriment or expense of off-field engagements, but rather, you know, advocating for education programs because of its well-being, performance, and commercial gains makes for a logical and really effective strategy moving sport forward. So if we know why it's important to empower athletes in education, then our research, it's really about answering that next question, which is how do we do it, and how do we do it well? So we took a survey to 132 professional athletes and 36 player development managers across the top 5 major professional codes in Australia. We used qualitative and quantitative data collection methods to try to capture the insights into their lived experience. And we used that to kind of map the factors that both empowered and inhibited their achievement in that space. Now, two themes were raised consistently across our results. So they were flexibility and the role of the player development manager. And I'll expand on both of these in detail in a moment. But as a general point of summary, when participants spoke about flexibility, they talked about tailoring courses and delivery models around their unique needs. And when they talked about the role of the player development manager, they spoke about the nature of personal support and empowerment, and even some of the spaces where perhaps they had some difference in perspectives. Now, before I move on, of course, it's important just to flag and keep in mind that this research comes from an Australian context. So while hopefully the information is going to be relatable to everybody in this webinar, it may not be replicable, and that really depends on your country of origin and the kind of systems that you work within. So let's kick off firstly by understanding why athletes engage in education. So we started our surveys asking exactly that, what motivated you? Now, as you can see from the graph in front of you, transition planning, personal development, these were highlighted as the most significant factors in that regard. But I want to draw your attention to transition planning, because when we had a closer look at that stat, we saw that 71% of athletes had identified transition planning as a factor that they'd considered prior to engaging in education for the first time. And that was matched by 54% of player development managers. When we asked what might influence their future engagement, though, that figure rose to what was a pretty overwhelming 86% majority. So these findings are important for a few reasons. And one is that they tell us that sport's doing a really good job of supporting athletes' understanding of some of the risks that come with retirement. But what I'm concerned about is that it might also suggest to us that education is still quite strictly understood within the domain of that wellbeing space. So we take another look at that original graph, and some of the factors like improving performance are still quite understated by contrast. All right, let's move into the first of our higher order themes, which was flexibility. So our research was oversaturated with references to this idea of flexibility, and that was really about the growing need for more flexible practices in delivering education to athletes. So our research really demonstrates this, and we talk about how the unique lives of athletes are at a discord with some of the mainstream education models. And we really make a case for change in that regard. So let's start with course duration. So we asked athletes, if we're at their discretion, what would be the ideal length of a degree? And as you can see, their response was that 85% preferred courses within a 12-month cap. And we really believe this has a lot to do with the length of sporting contracts, which, as you know, are typically quite short-termed. And that really means that athletes are not likely to plan further than the length of their contract. And there's a few quotes here that help to support that view. You're not going to get anything over 12 months with the nature of contracts. You don't know where an athlete will be in 2 years. And unsurprisingly, play development managers were in agreement. Over half of our participants specifically noted contract duration as a major barrier for athletes across our qualitative data. Now, one of the important implications of this is that athletes are significantly overrepresented in short-term education courses. And for our National Rugby League competition, that's 71% against 29% when we're talking about formal education enrolments. So this idea that sort of sticks to sport, that athletes don't want to study, or worse still, that they just don't have the ability to, really needs to be challenged, because it might actually be that some of the systems and the structures that actually facilitate their education opportunities have significant limitations. And one of those conditions clearly is the nature of contracts and course duration. So let's keep moving, and we'll stay within this conversation of flexibility. And I want to have a look at study load. So we asked athletes how much capacity they had to commit to study each week. And on average, that was 7 hours, and that was split 50% self-directed and 50% face-to-face. Now, when we have a look at the expectations of our country's leading education providers, who are TAFE, who provide kind of vocational skills training, and of course our university system, that's 18 hours and 40 hours respectively. And that's nearly 6 times that of the athlete's capacity. Now, when we have a look at part-time options, these seem slightly more viable. You know, at a minimum, TAFE expect 3 hours per week and 10 from the university. But the trouble is, you know, studying at that rate, it'd take an athlete 16 years to complete a university degree. So, you know, we think about that, and we recognise that sport puts a lot of pressure on athletes to engage in education. And we tend to hold university up as the holy grail of achievement. But really, at some point, we need to ask ourselves how fair and realistic these expectations are. And perhaps even further still, we need to be having the same conversations with our education providers. All right, this is the last one for flexibility, and I want to talk about delivery models. So when we asked athletes about their preferred learning environment, unsurprisingly, face-to-face at the club was given greatest preference. So you'll notice here, though, that I've highlighted virtual classroom and distance education, because while these are definitely like viable options in accommodating for greater flexibility to athletes, they also provide the least amount of personal support. And interestingly, when we gave a set of hypothetical scenarios to athletes where we put personalised support in relation to cost, athletes by a landslide preferred the degree that provided more support despite that increase in fees. We've got some quotes here that support this as well. So we would pay higher if the emphasis is on outcome, being job ready, having opportunities and placement. Money is not an issue for full-time athletes. And these views were shared by 85% of player development managers. Now, interestingly, just by chance, yesterday I stumbled across this quote from Professor David Lavalley, who says, when a player is faced with a choice between 2 offers in the near future, a higher salary and less support, or less salary and more support, I predict players will elect to play for the club with the best player support structure. And certainly our research and that finding support this view. Okay, so what does all of this mean? Well, one, I think that a need for greater support really indicates to us that athletes are struggling to meet the demands of their courses. And again, I'll refer back to some of the challenges that we've just outlined. And 2, the fact that athletes are, you know, prepared to invest more financial resources into their studies really means that there may be scope to fund tailored programs that better accommodate for their needs. All right, let's move on to the next second major finding, which was really about this role of the player development manager. So throughout our results, both player development managers and athletes spoke about their relationship consistently. Personable, reliable, trustworthy. These were just kind of some of the words that they used to describe that relationship. And involved was another. 90% of our player development managers believed it was important that they be involved in the athlete's education journey. But what is the role of the player development manager in an education context? Well, their descriptions were kind of twofold, and they often oscillated between what they described as, firstly, a task-oriented and sort of administrative position, but they also maintained this identity as an informal personal support that sat outside of the sporting environment. Now, one of the more impressionable findings was that player development managers had a really strong comprehension of empowerment and strengths-based practice. So empowerment which is defined as the process of becoming stronger and more confident, especially in controlling one's life and claiming one's rights. Now, really admirably, this is exactly how player development managers perceived the nature of their support. They had this consistent desire to try to remove themselves from the success of their athletes, and they really tried to minimize dependence on their support wherever possible. So 2 quotes that I think really demonstrate this well is, I don't want to be remembered as the support person. I want the athlete to feel that they've achieved it all by themselves. And I want them to know that there is a plan and a pathway that they have come up with. Now that's important for a few reasons, but perhaps crucially, given that 82% of our athletes stated that a disassociation with life after sport, or not really knowing what career path to take, was the most prevalent barrier that kept them from engaging in education for the first time. Now, empowerment-based practice is the kind of approach that's going to have the most impact in that regard. And perhaps also emphasising the significance of that relationship was that 76% of athletes felt they'd benefit from more support and presence from their player development managers. Of course, though, there were instances and spaces where player development managers and athletes didn't share the same perspectives. When we asked all of our participants to rank their expectations of education provided, these were some of the kind of major discrepancies that cropped up for us. So enjoyment was second most important for athletes, but it was ranked 8th for player development managers. Pathways into university was 3rd for athletes, but 13th for player development managers. And lastly, athletes really expected to study at home. They placed no home study at 3rd last, 13th, compared to 2nd for player development managers. So these differences, of course, have implications. And I really think that in many ways, they sort of mirror the broader stigmas that affect athletes engaging in education. But as our research has really shown, athletes, they do want to engage in the highest levels of study, but it's really because of the nature of their careers that they often don't get the opportunity to. We all know that athletes work hard, that they're resilient, that they're passionate. This is what society really admires most about them. So we can't afford to overlook or undermine those qualities when they're the athlete's greatest asset, pushing them through all of these barriers and challenges that they face in pursuing their education goals. So what does all of this mean? How do we pull it together and make some strategies moving forward? Well, excitingly, I really think this process has already begun with the growth of this concept around holistic well-being, which is the idea that the best way to support an athlete is to support the person, the entire person, both on the field and off, personally and professionally, and through all of that grey space in between. What we're suggesting is a model that fits within this framework, and we've called it the multidimensional needs of the athlete. So as you can see in the diagram, the athlete's experience of education sits at an intersection of all of these interests. So you're probably looking at that and thinking, the challenge naturally is really trying to get these departments to work together. And rather than competing for the time and attention of athletes, really understanding that when they work together, they benefit from one another. It's really simply about highlighting each other's strengths and trying to universalize their common characteristics. So we're suggesting that this equation is going to help to unlock some of the answers to these challenges. And it's a little academic, so I'll explain it to you quickly now. So compatibility, this is about that relationship between those various interests. So the performance, the commercial, the well-being. Now, education is in complement to all of those factors. So as long as we're creating clear and substantiated messages around the impact of education, then we're really doing a good job of this. And then centrality. This is about the degree to which those interests are treated with equal value. So we ask questions, is there a hierarchy at our club? What seems to take priority all the time? Now, remember, this isn't about trying to change a performance focus in sport. It's simply about trying to create equal opportunities in all spaces. So when compatibility meets centrality, this is how we rebuild the structures of elite athlete education. So let's take a look over our key findings and recommendations. 1, mainstream avenues of education are failing to meet the unique needs of athletes. 2, flexibility is key to empowerment. So that's tailored delivery models, study load, course duration. These are the ways that that can be achieved. And 3, investing in individual support is needed. And we recommend, we really need to start making those diverse benefits, the impact of education on performance and the business, just as well as well-being. We need to make that common discourse and really present around sport. And secondly, designing and delivering athlete-specific education programs. Now, of course, these are not short-term fixes, but for us, we're really in it for the long game, because we believe that the best way to see sustainable improvements in athletes' education is to change the systems that facilitate it. And we really think that this can happen, but first we need athletes, we need coaches, administrators, even our education providers, all getting on the same page and talking about where we're at. That's all for us for now, but definitely stay tuned for future iterations of this project. We've got some things in the works, and we're really hoping to build on some of those findings. But for now, thanks for zooming in. And if you've got any questions, please shoot them, and I'll reintroduce the research team. They'll help me field those. So that's Dr. Neil Hall of Western Sydney University and Leon Keir as well. Thank you very much.
That was awesome. Thank you, Sam.
Pleasure.